The scene is set.
Eucalyptus.
Invasive albino king snakes.
Emerald ash borer and its parasitoids.
The world's largest amphibians.
The invasive species that is humans. I'm Kirsten.
And I'm Nicholas. Welcome to the Anthropocene. The scene is set. The moon illuminates a thin layer of clouds that create an equally delicate mist that permeates the air, filling your lungs with warm condensation after every breath. You throw your line back into the canal, awaiting the shock from your line being pulled taut by a trophy fish awaiting below. The surface of the silent, glassy water is shattered by a writhing mass of smooth, dark scales. The mass approaches the shore. Suddenly, it squirms out of the water onto the land. An alligator? A snake? Neither. The grass parts to reveal the unmistakable silhouette of a fish, flailing towards you with a mouthful of teeth held agape. Suddenly, darkness. Someone has just changed the channel. And hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode.
Hello, hello.
So, yeah, that introduction is definitely different than what we typically do, and there will be a reason for that. And I'll kind of explain throughout without giving away too much right off at the start here. But without further ado, I say let's jump right into it, shall we?
Yeah, let's get swimming.
Well, first off, Kirsten, how are you doing?
I'm doing well today. I woke up with a pretty bad headache, but I did some yoga, had a coffee, and I think I'm ready to go.
Perfect. That's what we like to hear. Yeah, so right now we are recording, well, Kirsten's recording from her typical area in her office, but I am actually recording from my office because my neighbors were exceptionally loud this morning and we've had problems with my internet connection back there. So hopefully this will fix that. I might just have to be coming into work on weekends. First off, we're going to jump right into what we're talking about because I kind of implied like several different things right off with that introduction. I don't think I gave quite as much information as I typically do, but we are talking about invasive fish, specifically the snakehead fish, which is the common name for multiple genera of fish. And snakehead have developed quite the level of fame over the last few decades with tons of headlines about their insane adaptations and, quote, monstrous qualities. As we start to break everything down, though, you'll kind of start to see that there appears to be something fishy going on here. There are currently two genera of snakehead that have been found to establish invasive populations. We have the Asian snakeheads within the genus Channa and the African snakeheads within the genus Parachanna. So, although both genera of snakehead have been detected outside of their native range, when we're looking at identifying one of them, the Asian genus Channa seems to be responsible for establishing the most aggressive and famous populations. So from this point on, I'm probably just going to be referring to the Channa genus unless I otherwise specify it. And spoiler alert, I will not be talking about Parachanna at all because there's really no information on them. And quite frankly, I don't even know if that species of snakehead is establishing invasive populations anywhere. It does seem like a lot of papers reference both the Asian and African species of snakehead, but there's no real clues to indicate that the African species are invasive. So if anybody does know if there's like papers on that, feel free to send them to us because I'd love to read them.
Are they hard to distinguish physically?
Phenotypically,
yeah.
Well, actually, I break down both physical traits between both genera. So they're pretty similar, more or less. Like,
Okay.
You would be forgiven if you were unable to distinguish both of the genera from one another. However, personally, I think that the African genus kind of looks a little bit more prehistoric. They look like bichers, kind of. If anybody keeps fish, that's like a pretty famous fish that's kept in captivity. But I would say that more or less they look similar, but with the Asiatic species being like the most famous. So like the phenotypic traits for all of them, which is just the physical trait differences with both genera. Also, in case you're new to the phylogenetic world and are lost when I refer to the word genera or genus, I'll just do a quick aside and explain that a genus is just the taxonomic delineation above species. So just to give a super quick example using snakehead, we have the giant snakehead, which is Channa micropeltes, and the northern snakehead, which is Channa argus. So the first word in the scientific name is the genus. So Channa is the genus, which is basically just a quicker way to refer to all the species that are related to each other at that level, rather than mention each species individually. So between the two genus or genera that we have here, Channa and Parachanna, that's where they're separated, is in that first species name right there. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. And then those would be in the same family, probably.
Right, yeah. If they're in the
Right,
same
yeah.
genera, then they would be in the same family or subfamily even, depending on
Mhm.
what that is. But I don't know that much of the phylogeny between the two genera because I really only looked into the Asiatic species. And that's the only one I actually have any experience with. So, all right, let's see if I can paint a physical picture of a snakehead for y'all. First, picture a fish. All right, got that fish in your head, typical fish? Cool. Throw all of that out the window because snakehead really don't follow the traditional rules of fish at all. Personally, I think they give off more eel vibes than anything. They're a pretty long fish, which is probably one of the reasons why they get their name. Their heads are also rather elongated, and they kind of eventually taper down into a mouth that is just loaded with teeth, which we'll get to in a bit. They've got these long, undulating bodies, and instead of having like the traditional dorsal and anal fins that you'll see on most fish, they extend past where they stop on typical fish and run down the entire length of the body, basically to the tail fin. So they have these like ridges of fins that run down the top and bottom of their bodies. Their pectoral fins are pretty large and lobed, which you see from like fish that will like sit in place and wait and, or sit at the bottom of like waterways and stuff like that. And they've got like a ton of different variations of colors within all of the species within the genera. And a lot of the colors end up being like different striping or splotch patterns, which are likely for camouflage and things of that nature. So back to the teeth. This is probably like their most notorious feature. I couldn't really find any information on like actual bite force, but media headlines would have you believe that they can bite through a steel-toed boot, which is absolutely a farce. That's a total lie. That is, they're not capable of doing that.
Okay.
If one of these fish can bite through your steel-toed boot, then you should get a refund for those boots. Their bite force, though, is respectable. Like, it's not something to just like shake a stick at. There's videos of them biting out of the water after like anglers have caught them, and you can hear the echo of the bite from how hard they're slamming their jaws shut. And ultimately, they rely on their incredibly sharp teeth and thrashing body movements to rip apart prey. So you're probably not so much worried about the bite force as you would be worried about getting absolutely torn apart if you were to get bitten up by one of these animals. So before we get into like the real science of everything, there's a ton of rumors about these types of fish. They're actually vilified like pretty regularly in the media. Not so much anymore, but more so in like the early 2000s when they were first discovered and misinformation was circling around about them. So I think the only time I've seen more rumors going around about something was when I watched Mean Girls.
She knows everything about everyone.
That's why her hair is so big. It's full of secrets.
We should just throw pretty much all of these rumors right out the window right now. According to uninformed media outlets and terrible B-movies, snakehead are viciously aggressive, venomous fish with the ability to move across land with no issue and seek out humans specifically to attack them and rip them apart. And pretty much all of that is just absolute false. It's just not correct at all. So they're not venomous, for starters, not at all. That's likely just something made up because of their association with snakes. They have absolutely no relation to snakes or any reptiles for that matter, and get the name because of their elongated, undulating bodies and nothing else. It's a colloquialism for their common name. It's really just not representative of them genotypically at all. So these fish are capable of breathing air using their gills and can survive in low oxygen environments for an extended period of time. So they can breathe outside of the water for quite a long time. However, on land, they're pretty much worthless as far as locomotion goes. They can at some level get some traction by undulating their bodies back and forth, but this is primarily when they're really young. Theoretically, they can move on land when they're younger, but it's very likely that their movements are aided by flood events that create corridors for their movement. So just shallow areas where they can still sort of use water to get traction. They can probably move outside of the water and thrash back and forth to some degree, but they're not like actively out on land looking for prey or anything like that.
Right. So you can kind of see where the rumors started from, but they're definitely not accurate.
Right. Like if you have all the information lined up for their abilities and stuff like that, like it does kind of create like the perfect storm for media to take that and run with it and be like, look at these monstrous fish. So they're also like incredibly famous for their aggression. They're supposed to be these incredibly mean and angry fish, attack anything that goes in their water. Not if it's prey, anything. They will just bite at anything. And in reality, like most fish, they're pretty skittish and will avoid most interactions with something significantly larger themselves, like, for example, humans. However, during the breeding season, they are kind of famously territorial and protective of their brood. What they do is they kind of have these, like, schools of their young, and the adults will swim around them, protecting them. During this time frame, it is possible that certain species would be more inclined to fend off potential predators of their young. And the most famous for this behavior, and probably where this stems from, is the giant snakehead, which is like genuinely will attack pretty much anything that goes near their brood. And other species within the genus are actually cited as being significantly less aggressive during this time period. So that behavior appears to be more reserved towards the giant snakehead. And as we'll get into it, we'll start to realize that giant snakehead is not really something we need to worry about outside of its native range. So, as is the case with most animals portrayed in negative light in movies and the media, it's really all just exaggeration and misunderstood behavior. For anyone who's listening, excited to hear about these monstrous fish, you might be a little disappointed by the end of this, but I think you're going to be interested to understand how they got these sort of ridiculously outrageous rumors circulating about them. So, honestly, these fish are relatively harmless to humans in the grand scheme of things. However, this is the Anthropocene, and we tend to make everything about ourselves, when in reality we should probably be far more worried about the effects on the ecosystems that these invasive species have been introduced to. I'm curious about your thoughts so far on these monster fish. Have you heard about them, or is this more like a U.S. kind of fear-mongering thing?
I'm going to say mostly U.S. I've heard the name snakehead, and like it sounds familiar, and I did quickly Google an image just to really get it, and it kind of looks like a pike crossed with a burbot. I don't know if anybody knows like what those two are.
If anybody actually fishes, they look very similar to bowfin.
Right. Yeah. So I haven't heard way too much about them. But yeah, I'm not overly surprised that, this fish that has big teeth and might be kind of aggressive would end up being exaggerated so much. And I mean, like, you're talking about them being more aggressive around their broods. Like, we're just not as used to that behavior in like fishes in general. Mm-hmm. But if you want to talk about like, mama bear, like a bear doesn't like usually hunt down and look for people. But if you get between bear and cub, then they attack you. So it's the same kind of thing, but
right. Just misunderstood behavior.
Yeah. Well, and parental care is just so rare in fishes. It's not so rare, but it's less rare or less common in fishes than in other animal groups. So,
yeah. So if you haven't caught on yet, we tend to follow like a very specific type of script every episode, and sometimes having the same prompts for like wildly different animals, or in many cases a group of animals, can make things difficult. So when we're talking about like multiple species, or even in this case genera, I tend to lean towards the simplification or highlighting specific species for the sake of time and interest. So from here on out, I will be generalizing. Haha. Yeah. So we'll be discussing 3 primary species of snakehead, focusing primarily on the Channa genus, or the snakehead from the continent of Asia. When we're looking at the detrimental populations of snakehead, although multiple sources will reference the Parachanna or African snakeheads, they seem to focus primarily on the impacts of Asiatic species, like I mentioned in the beginning. So to be even more specific about which species I'm talking about, we're going to be talking about bullseye snakehead, Channa maruleus, northern snakehead, C. argus, and giant snakehead, C. micropeltes. So their native range is in the south of Asia, ranging from southern China up through Pakistan for bullseye snakehead specifically. Giant snakehead are more typically confined to the very southern parts of Asia, specifically Malaysia and Cambodia. And northern snakehead can actually be found all the way up into Russia. So they have quite the extensive range, and these species obviously make up pretty significantly different habitats. We see this as a relatively common trend amongst many invasive species where there just isn't really a lot of information on their native status. It's also difficult to quantify widespread invasives like the worst of the three, the northern snakehead, which has been introduced and established in so many populations on multiple continents and is almost always seen in a negative light, with information being geared towards their impacts rather than what they are like in their native habitat. Have you noticed that with some of the species you've talked about, Kirsten?
Yeah, it can be really hard to narrow down exactly like where they're from and where their impact is and what is just natural or exasperated by us or not so much. So yeah,
Right.
It's so complicated. It's so complex.
Right. So although it was difficult for me to find information on the native species within their home ranges, at least like cited information that was relevant to this, I was able to find a report on one of the species. And this was written in 2008 by Zandra Kambar following an aquaculture ban on giant snakehead in Cambodia. The report didn't mention anything specifically about the effects of the ban on giant snakehead populations, but did mention the overall decline in what they referred to as quote unquote low value fish within the lake ecosystem. So, being super carnivores, one would assume that the decline of food fish for the giant snakehead, coupled with farming and aquaculture methods, would have declines on its population. Though I couldn't find any specific sources to confirm that for sure. A 2011 study references declines in fish populations overall, and there is an implication that the bulk of the giant snakehead population in Cambodia may exist within cage farming practices, as wild fish populations are in severe decline overall. So, to be clear, the giant snakehead appears to be the least likely for introduction to other parts of the world, whereas the bullseye and northern snakehead are the primary focus of invasive species management practices. So from herein, we'll be narrowing our discussion further to exclude the giant snakehead unless otherwise discussed due to their relatively sequestered populations. There are a few places they've been discovered or caught, but I don't necessarily know that there's any real established breeding populations outside of their native range. So
the giant snakehead, I feel other people might be. Is it like that much bigger? Like, is it real big? How
so
big is
I
it?
know that the northern snakehead can get somewhere in the neighborhood of like 17 to 19 pounds, I think, on like the biggest end of it. And the giant snakehead is like 50 to 60 and more than 3 feet long on that end.
That's a big old fish though.
Yeah,
like...
it's a big fish. It's a big fish. I think they can even get bigger too. I'll look it up and it'll take me a quarter of a second. I'll cut out the pause. Yeah, about 5 feet and 40 pounds, 45 pounds.
Yeah, that's
significantly
like a small,
larger. Yeah.
I was gonna say a small child, but that's like a small person.
Yeah, so they're like 3 times the size of the northern snakehead, if not bigger. Okay. So like 45 pounds or whatever that is in kilograms. If you're playing along, giant man-eating snakehead is another place on your ridiculous media bingo card that you can check off. And the free space is if I say balls. So moving on to why this particular invasive species is so successful. Many times we see invasive species become successful by occupying a specific niche and doing it so well that they exclude other animals by essentially taking up all of those resources. Similar to that guy in line right before you at the buffet who takes all the French fries on the plate, even though he already has plenty and you really wanted some. This niche occupation is still true for snakehead, but they're not necessarily a passive invasive species, if that makes sense. So I guess what I mean when I'm saying passive invasive species, that would be, in my mind, those species that are more or less affecting ecosystems by simply being present and removing available resources that suffocate out native species. Active invasive species, which I guess would be the antithesis of that, would be those species that are predominantly predators that are specifically consuming and or killing native species for one reason or another. So I guess that would be the difference between the active and passive invasive species I'm referring to. There's probably a specific name for those, but I didn't look them up, so this is what you're getting. So to answer the question of why snakehead are so successful, simply put, they're incredibly aggressive hunters that actively predate native fish without the existence of any real natural predators that can control their populations. So, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. They eat the native fish. That's and there's nothing that eats them. So I don't think we've done a lot of these like super hyper predators as invasive species
No,
yet.
I think most of the stuff we've done is like, it is like direct competition, but not like you said, like actively hunting or even indirect stuff. But yeah, we haven't done like something's coming in and eating everything. Yeah, and I didn't do the research, but also like the fact that they have parental care of their offspring, you would think would also make them like more successful reproductively, right? Because maybe the little fish could be eaten by native species, but not if they're actually being protected.
Right. And I don't know if all of the species exhibit that brooding behavior. I know it's just most famous in the giant snakehead. So it might not be but I do believe that it does happen in the other species, but they might not be as aggressively defensive. And just to be crystal clear, when I'm saying aggressive, I'm specifically discussing their feeding strategies towards items they see as prey and not humans. I just want to be extra clear so there's no like misinterpretation. Like when we see media outlets paint these animals as deadly monsters, they're really just super effective predators that can survive in super diverse habitat conditions. Personally, I think it's super easy to vilify predators like snakehead, which is probably why they get supervillain statuses in media. It's easy to use these fish that have a very recognizable predatory adaptation to strike fear into people. Fear gets ratings, so media leans into that one way or another. But here's some anti-media for you. I could not find a single reference or instance in which a snakehead attacked or inflicted any damage on anyone outside of people who are like anglers actively handling them incorrectly or accidental bites when they're out of the water.
I was going to say Uncle Dave, like 6 beers in, that got viciously attacked by, a 20-foot snakehead that was 100 pounds.
Yeah. He crawled out on land and attacked their children in the backyard pool.
Right.
But yeah, so at this point, it might actually seem like I'm advocating for these fish, and that's not necessarily my intention. I am saying that we need to use facts and statistics to quantify and verify the actual harm these fish cause, and that is to native ecosystems. So these hyperpredators get to respectable sizes. When I say hyperpredators, I mean something that is exclusively carnivorous, like cats, for example. They get around 30 inches in length, which is quick, Kirsten. What in centimeters?
30 inches should be like, oh God, like 67. How much is it?
I have a tape measure, but it doesn't have centimeters on it right now.
Oh God, okay.
It's funny because
30?
I do...
exactly back. 30 inches is 76 centimeters, not
very
67.
close. Okay.
Not bad. Okay.
So, which is still pretty big either way. And they're capable of killing and eating many native fish species at that size without their numbers being reduced by natural factors. Several species demonstrate the ability to inhabit plenty of different ecosystem temperatures and types, and take all of that and give them the addition of being able to survive in extreme conditions like low oxygen and water levels, and being capable of moving through areas other fish would be restricted from, and you get all the makings for an extremely devastating invasive species. Or do you? My mic keeps falling because I have it on my desk drawer.
Well, that was anticlimactic.
It's just like
not
slowly,
the perfect setup.
It's slowly like retracting, and I'm like leaning farther and farther down.
We almost need like as a backup, like just a little mic stand that goes on the desk.
Right.
Yeah.
So where is the species currently invasive? So northern snakehead, with its more temperate climate preferences, has been introduced to more northern parts of the U.S., as would make sense. More temperate climates exist within the northern U.S. That's probably where they're going to establish better populations. Bullseye snakehead are more prominent in warmer climates in their native habitat and have established populations non-natively in Hawaii and Florida. Introductions of different species throughout Europe and Asia are also present. So the primary concern for these species, though, does seem to be the eradication from the U.S. and the prevention and establishment from other U.S. states and Canada. So that's where it seems to be restricted. And we'll get into that a little bit later. So how was it introduced? How did this extremely monstrous fish get introduced outside of its native populations? Well, it's a fish, so there's really no mystery behind the introduction of invasive fish, specifically snakehead. There's a massive global fish market for fish consumption. The use of live fish markets and the distribution of these markets throughout the world allow for the direct transportation of these fish and many other fish from non-native habitats to areas where they could become successful. I mean, this must be like the main introduction method for most invasive species of fish. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yeah, I was gonna say that's a huge one for most of them. Like purposeful introduction for sport fishing, or like you said, like accidental through markets. The only one that's a little bit different is, for example, like the lampreys in North America. Like we're mostly coming on in ship ballasts. So the ship takes up a bunch of water in a harbor and then like totes across and dumps it out after. But those ones I think are the rarer but very interesting ones. We'll get there at some point, I think, because lampreys are bad.
Yep.
So
the other big factor, which is according directly to the USGS, and it does make sense, is the aquarium hobby. You've got these hypercarnivorous fish that are quite powerful and beautiful and make for interesting animals to view. But they also get pretty big. People like to intentionally release these animals because they can no longer care for them, or to purposefully establish populations for later collection for the aquarium and fisheries industries. So, yeah. Exactly.
For anybody who's just listening, I just like flopped back in my chair in dismay. So,
right. Oh, so also when I was looking around, I also saw these things that some places referred to as quote unquote spiritual releases. And now that I'm thinking about that kind of sounds like something you'd get at Burning Man. But these are situations where certain religions or spiritualities will quote unquote save animals from fish markets and things of that nature and release them into the wild to gain karma with a deity or just in general in their life. Which honestly, that really irritates me because you're taking these fish, most of which are probably not going to be able to survive where you're releasing them, and the intention is to gain karma for yourself by releasing them. It seems like pretty indulgent and selfish to me, especially when you consider that if someone is doing that, they're literally perpetuating the sale of these fish by creating a demand for them. I'm not knocking on any specific religion or spirituality here. I'm just like thinking if you're going to go that route, then there are better things you could do for conservation karma, if you know what I mean. Yeah, this is kind of off track, but I actually looked into this further, and apparently now there are one or more religions that have adopted this practice and changed its teaching to include information about releasing animals in their proper ecosystem and not spreading invasive species anymore. Because there was I believe it was in New York, there were people rescuing turtles from markets and stuff like that and releasing them into the main pond there in what the hell is the name of the fucking
Central Park?
Yeah, Central Park. Yeah.
Okay.
Releasing them into the Central Park pond, and people were like, where are these all of these non-native turtles coming from? Like they kept finding them, and then they found out that it was like this, group of people who were trying to get that karma or whatnot, and then they were educated about how that was actually negatively impacting native flora and fauna, and they now teach that it's specifically supposed to be for the benefit of the animals and the ecosystem, not just the animals. So if you're going to go about it, that's the way to do it. Provide education to do it properly so it doesn't harm the ecosystem. So where is this species the worst? I kind of hinted at this earlier, but I guess this question kind of really depends on which species you're discussing out of the three. Primarily, though, it does seem like this is another invasive species that is most impactful within the United States. At the beginning, I asked Kirsten what her thoughts were or like knowledge of this fish were. And that's because when I was a kid, I basically saw so many documentaries and like fearmonger media clips about this species living in the US and stuff that I thought this animal would be something that like everyone knew about. But like not everyone does. I feel like it was more an early 2000s thing where it was just like, oh my God, they're destroying everything. They're going to come out and crazy monster fish from the depths, blah, 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 stuff like that. But in reality, it was kind of this just like one smear campaign for them when they were discovered because there was just a media boom at the time. And I just happened to be like very receptive of that information. So to me, this is like one of the first invasive species that I wanted to look into when I went into college because I thought that it was going to be this massive problem that was going to overtake the US and destroy our waterways and things like that. Turns out it's not.
Right.
I mean, it's
Okay.
not good, but it's not like other species of invasive fish in other areas, which are significantly more aggressive. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say if you were to compare the Asian carp and these guys, which would you put as being worse?
Oh, Asian carp for sure.
Right.
Because it seems like Asian carp will absolutely suffocate out an ecosystem from the bottom up, preventing all other species, episode 1, to be unable to live in those ecosystems. Whereas the snakehead, it seems like they do compete with, but we'll get into a little bit later the details of that, but they don't necessarily suffocate out other predators even.
Right. Okay. All right.
Yeah, anecdotally, I am also starting to realize that there are a lot of invasive species that I choose for my episodes that are ones I've seen personally and have some experience with. Therefore, they usually reside in the US as I do. So I do apologize if you're from one of the other 9 countries of listeners. Feel free to comment some of your country's most aggressive invasive species. I'd love to do an episode that focuses something more outside my personal realm of experience and jump to other parts of the world. Because I feel like when we go to mine, almost all of them are problematic specifically within the US, with only a few exceptions.
Yeah, I keep going to Canada and Ecuador because that's just like where our experience is right now. So we'd love
Right.
to reach out some more, but someone could give us a nudge maybe and we can do that. But
Right, yeah. And I mean, we can do research on stuff we haven't done. I mean, I did the episode on invasive snakes, albino king snakes.
yeah.
So anyway, jumping right back into it, we have the 2 most invasive species of all genera of snakehead that seem to be the northern and the bull-sized snakehead, C. argus and C. marulius, respectively. Northern snakehead have a more expanded range through multiple U.S. states, whereas the bull-sized snakeheads seem to be wreaking more havoc within Florida and the warmer areas, specifically in Florida. Specifically in, like, I think it's like Palm Springs. I can't remember the specific one. I don't want to say it because I don't want to give the wrong thing, but in the canals of like somewhere in southern Florida. So I'm going to split the impacts of both these species using separate studies just to keep everything clear for y'all. So we'll start out with northern snakehead. And let me just say, for all the media specials, horror movies, and monstrous animals shows made about this fish, there's actually not a ton of real scientific information on the impacts of these fish on ecosystems, ironically. Well, quantifiable data, I should say, which is a shame. There was a study done by Saylor, RK, LaPointe, NWR, and Angermeyer, PL, in 2012 that wanted to look at the primary diet of snakehead fish within the Potomac River. Of snakehead fish within the Potomac River Basin, which is in the northeastern U.S. around Virginia and Maryland. This is also, incidentally, where I found a lot of data collection being done on the species due to the highly established populations within this watershed. So a lot of the information you're going to hear is probably from the Potomac. I don't know why I can't say it. I can say it in my head, but I can't say it out loud. A lot of the information you're going to be hearing is probably from the Potomac River. So the study looked at gut content of northern snakehead within the river and found out that their diets were almost exclusively piscivorous, which means they were eating fish. Compared that to the other predatory fish, like largemouth bass, for example, where that species in particular had over 10 times the amount of crustacean consumption and gut content analysis. This study then goes on to hypothesize that many of the natural fish predators in the ecosystem occupy different niches than the snakehead, which were exhibiting ontogenetic shifts within their diet. Therefore, they said that the snakehead may be occupying a novel niche and not be affecting native predators in incredibly significant ways, which is interesting.
Very interesting.
That is neat.
Now, this was done back in 2012, so it would be interesting to see if there were more recent studies done on this to get a more clear look at, the potential impacts. And there are, and I have one here, and I'm going to read it now. So, Love JW and Newhart JJ in 2021 published data that used other data published on snakehead in the Potomac region to determine the maximum consumption biomass of native fish species by a population of 600 snakehead. So basically, they modeled their data on information provided by the consumption rates of snakehead to determine how much food could be consumed by a population of 600 of them. Since snakehead predate pretty much exclusively on fish, they were able to determine what sort of population impacts they may have on an area they've been introduced to, rather than the previous study that was concerned more with their niche occupation. Like we discussed earlier, these are invasive predators that are more directly affecting populations by consuming them. Therefore, if you're just looking at dietary overlap, it's entirely possible that greater impacts are not being displayed in that data. However, if you take a study like this last one and look at how they are directly consuming native fish, you might get a better picture of the direct impacts of an ecosystem. You may get a better picture. I'm starting to lose my voice. I haven't talked this much in a while because I don't do...
Oh, man.
Anyway, so, however, if you take a study like this last one and look at how they are directly consuming native fish, you may get a better picture of their direct impacts on an ecosystem by quantifying the specific biomass of native fish they can consume. So data. Essentially what we're looking at is the annual consumption, 2,198 kilograms for this outlined population of 600 snakehead annually, which is about 4,845 pounds, or approximately in the neighborhood of 2 tons. This is kind of where I went on a fun tangent and did some hypothetical math using known statistics and projections, and this is where it actually gets really intimidating. Up until this point, we've kind of just been seeing like all of the negative impacts for these potential super predators not really being quantified or being dismissed as not that significant. But again, if you have data, but you're looking at the wrong conclusion, like the niche occupation, rather than the direct impact of quantified consumed biomass, how much fish these invasive fish are eating, you're actually not going to see the right impacts, right? Basically, the first study is great because it said this is what we shouldn't be looking at because there's no discernible data here. But it is an invasive species. They're reproducing. Their numbers are increasing drastically in this non-native ecosystem. So they must be having some impact. That just means we have the wrong type of data that we're collecting to reach this conclusion. So we need to look at other data. So that other study, by quantifying their biomass, is now looking at a different potential impact. Does that make sense?
Right, yeah, but just to clear up, the first one was saying they looking at their niche occupation to see if they might be overlapping with other things, what their problem is, and they figured out that they're only eating fish.
Right.
But then that opened up the ability for the next paper to focus in on the fact that they're only eating fish, though, right?
Right.
So it's kind of like a good base for it.
Yeah, I don't think the papers had any relation to one another, but just the fact that the first one exists means that it was ruled out. Well, not necessarily ruled out. It was still important information. They made conclusions. It's just the conclusions didn't give the information of the actual impacts. So it's not to say that first study was bad. It was good. It still came to conclusions and helped determine things. So, like I said, I kind of just started looking into other studies and stuff like this, and I wanted to kind of synthesize some different information to do some hypothetical stuff. So, this is not, I mean, I'm using cited information, but this is a synthesis that I've done and using estimates based from other published papers. So, Resch CA, Galaska MP, and Mahan RAR published a study in 2018 where they did population estimates on northern snakehead through genomic analysis. Genomic or genomic analysis is insanely interesting, but also I don't personally have enough knowledge or understanding of it to explain it in any real attainable way. So read the paper. It's in the show notes. And I'll give a direct quote from the paper for a basic understanding of how they're using this genomic data. So the data obtained through genomic methods can provide valuable information about the population structure of a species that is rare in a system and is especially advantageous because small sample sizes have been shown to be capable of determining fine-scale population structure that accurately represent populations. They're basically using nucleotide diversity in a sampled population to determine overall population size, which is really, really cool.
Yeah, that is
And
cool.
even more simply put, and at this point, I'm bastardizing it so much that it is not a fully correct statement at this basic of a level, but they are essentially using existing DNA samples to estimate populations within the sampled areas. Again, read the paper. It goes into a lot more detail, more so than me just explaining it here. But the long and the short of it is they were able to obtain estimated long-term population sizes of snakehead within the Potomac River Basin and several others. And they basically came up with the fact that, or there could be a population of 3,422,500 individuals to 34,225,000 individuals for the Potomac River Basin alone. So there's potential for millions of snakehead to exist within this basin and other basins that they spread to, with just a few hundred able to consume a ton of fish each year. So like 300 fish can theoretically consume a ton of biomass. While we can't be making direct conclusions here, I do think it's fairly safe that the introduction of snakehead to a non-native habitat has significant potential to be highly detrimental to native fish populations of sport, economic, and most importantly, ecological significance. So remember that population of 600 snakehead, which is consuming 2 tons of food a year. Imagine a population of snakehead that's 34 million. Obviously, that's going to have genuine significant impacts on the populations of fish, of native fish. That was for the northern snakehead. And the implications of bullseye snakehead in South Florida are similar. However, the FWC has not indicated that they are presently a large threat to native fish populations, which is fairly interesting because you basically assume they're having negative impacts to some degree, but surprisingly, they don't appear to be completely decimating the ecosystems like other invasive species we've discussed where their eradication is completely necessary. Basically, what I'm saying is if they thought there was a problem, the FWC would get on it and put them as more of a priority species. But as it stands, there's not a ton of active destroying methods of these fish or eradication methods. It's more prevention.
Right. I wonder if in Florida maybe there's just enough other like similar fish that are competing with them or things that aren't natural predators but could be predating on them.
Right.
Possibly. Yeah.
So now we get to the what is being done. In 2014, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service submitted a plan of action for 3 species of snakehead. C. argus, C. maruleus, and C. micropeltes, most interestingly. Because if you remember, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was pretty much only concerned with, well, not that they were only concerned with, but the 2 ones that seemed to be problematic in establishing populations were the northern snakehead and the bullseye snakehead. Whereas, although they've been detected, there was no real breeding populations of giant snakehead that were outlined as being problematic. So it's interesting that they did include that in it, more as a preventative measure. So I just have direct quotes from this, and these are the 6 steps that they outlined. Number 1, which is prevent the importation into the U.S. by refining the Lacey Act and other regulations and improving the compliance and enforcement of this legislation. Basically, preventative measures. Number 2, contain the expansion of snakehead within the U.S. by assessing the risk of establishment and developing an effective snakehead surveillance program that can detect new introductions at a stage where populations are able to be eradicated. 3. Develop long-term adaptive management options to mitigate potential impacts of snakehead in U.S. waters where eradication is not possible. Number 4. Conduct research to better understand the pathways of spread and potential impacts of snakehead on aquatic ecosystems, as well as to develop more effective surveillance, control, and eradication methods. Number 5. Develop effective outreach materials to help prevent new introductions of snakehead within the U.S. and control the anthropogenic spread of established populations. And number 6 is just review and assess progress of the plan. So look back and see if these previous 5 steps are doing what they need to be doing. So I'm going to get a little sarcastic. I'm going to put on my sarcastic hat here and basically say, great work, guys. You really stepped up and made a plan. Let's dive into the recommended eradication methods also provided by the FWS for snakehead. This next is a direct quote from the Fish and Wildlife Service's website on snakehead removal. Direct quote after they've put in this plan for, snakehead eradication and control measures. The potential control methods for a snakehead infestation are limited. Physical removal of the fish using nets, traps, angling, electrofishing, or biological control by introduction of predators are not likely to be successful for large infestations. If the infestation is believed to be limited to a few individuals, the above techniques may be successful in removing the target organisms. However, even with a few individuals, it may be difficult to determine if the eradication was 100% successful. If the infestation is within an impoundment where water level control capability is available, removing all water may be a viable control technique. However, a water drawdown effort would result in damage to many desirable plant and fish species. An effort could be made to capture and relocate desirable species, but this would be an expensive and lengthy undertaking. Impoundments that are spring-fed may be difficult to keep dry, and the snakeheads may survive in the moist bottom sediments if any water is allowed to remain. Rotenone can be used to eradicate northern snakeheads from lakes and ponds. Rotenone is like a known chemical pesticide, so a fish killer.
Okay.
However, this chemical is not a selective pesticide and is effective against nearly all species of fish, native and non-native. The major drawback of targeting with rotenone is the loss of native fish species along with the target species. Endangered species within a water body may be impacted by this technique. However, every fish species may be impacted by the introduction of northern snakeheads. In many cases, rotenone may be the only option to eradicate the population and ensure the fish do not spread to other water bodies. Lot of this could be done, but really it's not going to happen.
Yeah, that plan looked so good on paper, and especially because they were talking about, maybe they're actually going to do stuff with the education, but it was a very good prevent, control, educate, a really well written thing, and then they'll come up with, and we can't actually do anything.
Yeah, we can't do anything except for spraying chemicals that kill everything. But it could be worse if we don't spray chemicals. It was like every sentence in that had an asterisk on it. So I'll let the viewers see that as they want. I won't go into more of it, but it's pretty clear to see that the intent of the plan itself is to prevent the spread and not necessarily eradicate snakehead at all. They gave so many different methods of eradication and basically said none of these will work. There doesn't really seem to be any incentive to do so, and there just don't actually seem to be many effective control methods. Does this mean that the Fish and Wildlife Service is just lazy? No. At least not in this case. Look at how the U.S. has tackled the eradication of other invasive species. Chiefly look at Asian carp, episode 1, like I mentioned, electrofences, hand removal, and other mass eradication events. Tons and tons. The list goes on and on. I think that was probably the episode with the most types of eradication methods. They're continuously being implemented and designed for the control of those fish. So why not the snakehead? Again, this sort of yields to the fact that they're not necessarily seen as such an aggressive threat to biodiversity, and nobody really deems it necessary for their removal, at least not at this point. People, organizations, and entities seem to rather focus on what they consider to be more aggressive invasive species. they're worth being acknowledged as potentially hazardous. We've seen that. But there's just not enough existing information or data to quantify their real impacts. What impacts they may have might not be observable within their short introduction detection in the early 2000s, or they might just not have visually observable impacts that warrant further action being taken. So think about that. Essentially, you're looking at this invasive species that there is data to suggest that they could be incredibly hazardous. There is data to suggest that they're becoming introduced to more places. There's practices and methods and papers written to say we should probably be doing something about this, but we don't have the money to do it. We're tackling so many other invasive species. And if nothing else, snakehead is a great example of how there's just so many different invasive species introduced throughout all of our ecosystems that really control at this point is very difficult. We have to limit our money and methods and practices to attack the ones that we consider to be the most detrimental to those ecosystems. So unfortunately, other species which may not be observably invasive at this point or have been recently introduced and we can't see the full extent of their potential impacts, we're not focusing on them right now. So this preventative measure that we're trying to do might not be enough to, in the future, control these invasive species that just haven't reached their full potential yet. Now, I'm not saying that the snakehead is an example of a species that is ever going to reach that full potential. It may or may not. We just don't have the data, frankly. But that just goes to show that it is important to constantly be doing research and understanding that there are so many invasive species that we just don't know the impacts of and we don't know about. So more money and conservation efforts and things like that, maybe we can take the time to put more efforts into understanding invasive species before they become a huge problem. Because as with so many things in nature, we end up seeing like we attack a problem once it's become to the point where we say, oh, we have no other choice. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, that means it's usually all too late. So it's probably better to put more efforts into preventative measures to prevent that, oops, we need to tackle it now when it's already out of control to stop things from being introduced. And there are new things that do that. There's new legislation and all those types of fun things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're super effective right now. So just food for thought.
Yeah, I think unfortunately we're just so reactive a lot of the times instead of proactive. But like the main thing that you said as well is just having to prioritize resources. And if we only have so much, we unfortunately are only able to be reactive and proactive through a little bit of education and trying to get people to fish that more and take them home and eat them and little things.
And I would also argue that you could probably save resources and funding by adopting more preventative measures. Absolutely. Because I think a lot of the times entities are hesitant to do something until it's too late because they'd rather weigh on that chance that it's actually not going to be a problem and then they have to spend no money. Versus spending a little money at the beginning, which, you're going to have to lose some money there. But in the long run, it's going to save you a bunch of money because you're tackling the problem when it's small. You're nipping that problem in the bud before it can really flourish. If you find a species that could potentially survive there, eradicate them. Don't just say, oh, well, they're not creating a problem right now. In the future, it could be significantly more. And you're going to waste a lot more money on that. Money and resources that could be better put to more preventative measures. That's my 2 cents on that whole thing.
Right. It's an investment.
Are these control methods affecting native biodiversity? Obviously, we didn't outline that many, but if draining and chemical methods are used like they did outline as potentially being successful, native plants and animals are obviously going to be impacted significantly by those. You use a pesticide that is exclusive to all fish and it just kills all fish. Yeah, it's going to have a direct impact. And if you drain an area, of course, it's going to have an impact. So right now, this episode is probably getting towards the end. So Kirsten and I will have a quick discussion regarding the efficacy of managing these species. And my question is, should we dedicate time and effort to managing this species that doesn't seem to have direct impacts on native biodiversity, at least not in the outline papers that I've put forth here?
Right. Let's take a real quick break. Think about that, and we'll be back.
Be right back.
The Anthropocene is an independent project by young ecologists hoping to educate and share interesting information about introduced species around the world. If you'd like to help us by sponsoring an episode, check out the links in the show notes. Okay, and we're back.
Hello.
So the question essentially is, do we invest now in eradicating / preventing something that is not too big of a deal yet? We have a little bit of data to suggest that it could be a big problem, but we know that it's, in the example of snakehead, a voracious predator that eats a lot of fish and is probably going to be an issue. Just starting us off, I think it's just investing in your future. Like, this applies so much to biology, but it applies to so many other things. Like, humans are so reactive instead of proactive. I mean, I don't want to get political, but we're living in a pandemic right now that we were so unprepared for, right? Because nobody took the time to like think about what could happen if it happened. And then it's the same thing with, we have this fish that's probably going to be a big deal later, but maybe it's not. So we don't do too much about it. So if we can just invest now, spend the money now, and like you said, it's probably going to be whatever you spend 30% in eradicating it when it's a little problem of what you'll have to spend later on if it becomes a big issue. Especially aquatic systems are so hard to deal with. Like you were saying, like the problems that they brought up in the Fish and Wildlife Service. You have to drain, you have to electrofish. I don't know if anybody's ever done like a fish collection. I did a fish rescue one year where we were like getting fish out of a draining dam, and it's a lot of work. Very cool, but it's so complicated, especially in aquatic systems. So I think, I don't know. I don't know if I see even more so in aquatic systems, but we really have to be more preventative.
I think too, in aquatic ecosystems, it does hit that whole non-observable state of things. We don't see that. We're not underwater. We don't know how many fish are down there. We don't really fully understand it. We have these new genomic surveys where we can do, the DNA testing and detect species and in what quantities and densities there, and get the population estimates and all that kind of stuff. That's super helpful. But scientists seeing this information is not the same as communicating it to the general public. Scientists are always going to be on the side of conservation, at least a scientist that's doing the research on that specific invasive species. They're always going to be on that side. The problem comes in translating the importance of that conservation to the public. And that's where you're really going to have to spend a lot of money and time and effort into verifying the data, because the data will say what we have data. I mean, like I've said that we don't have a ton of data, but the data is concrete. We see that they have direct impacts on the ecosystem. All invasive species are going to be detrimental to native ecosystems. Whether it's indirectly or directly, they are all going to have some level of impact upon native biota. Regardless of whether or not these impacts are observable to us is irrelevant, because we know that an ecosystem that is harmed and not performing its ecosystem services to the fullest is going to harm us directly. So it's in our best interest to implement these preventative measures to prevent the explosion of invasive species. Even if we dedicate some time to eradicating species that would never become invasive, we don't know that until they become invasive. So why would we wait?
Yeah, and we talk a little bit, I mean, throughout some episodes, that not every single non-native species ends up being quote unquote invasive or causing these problems, but why would you wait to find out? Essentially, right?
Yeah. The snakehead, honestly, it's a really interesting case for invasive species, and it doesn't follow our typical invasive species format. I think we're going to start deviating from that typical, this is the worst of the worst type stuff. We'll still have them in there, obviously, but the impacts on humans seem to be like wildly over exaggerated on the surface. They're vilified because we think that they're a danger to humans, and they're clearly not a direct danger to humans. And even in the scientific aspect of it, when you look at the lack of understanding, not necessarily just a lack of data, you see that they appear to be not that harmful of an invasive species. However, we don't have enough data to make conclusions, and that's kind of the thing is, and I bet you if you ask the scientists who work with snakehead and things like that, they'll tell you, because they observe that type of stuff. They'll probably say that they're incredibly detrimental to native fish populations. I think fishermen are already saying that type of stuff because they see the reduction of, their preferred, angler species, whatever that they're looking for.
Right.
But,
well, and I think it's. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was saying just in synthesis, like obviously there needs to be like a nice, pretty review paper written about this. But, what you brought forward today is we have this exclusively piscivorous, like super predator that in theory, like with these models could eat a ton of fish. And the environmental DNA says that there's a lot more of them than we think there is. So just those, synthesizing in a non-formal way, obviously, that's enough evidence, you would think.
Right, to at least further studies. But again, that last paper just came out in 2021.
Yeah.
So we might be right on the advent of more specific, intentional research and education on the eradication of these non-native species. We might be right there. However, again, you see there's this huge disjunct between media representation and stuff like that. And there's no benefit to vilifying these animals realistically, because that sets a precedent for other things, like, oh, we have to kill everything, and the human obsession with murdering things is not a healthy way to go about tackling scientific removal of species. There shouldn't be like a real excitement behind I get to go kill a bunch of stuff because the government and scientists say I can. It should be, I need to do this, unfortunately, to preserve the health of the ecosystems that have existed here that we have caused the destruction of in the first place.
Right. Just want to point out that we talked about snakehead before it was cool, essentially.
Right, yeah.
Actually, right
after it was cool, before it was cool a second time. Right. Right. Yeah, so essentially I wanted to kind of bring up this paper because I wanted you guys to sort of experience snakehead in the same way I did, as something that appears on the surface to be this crazy villain, but the more you look into it, it's really not villainous in the way that we typically portray villains, but the potential for it to become something incredibly detrimental and monstrous to our native ecosystems is something we really can't ignore or afford to ignore. It's a topic that gets you thinking a lot, and that's part of it. We want you to think, we want us to think, because this is all fun for us. We like to do the research and stuff like that and then form our own opinions on all the information and data and stuff. But it's a good example of basically the complications and the complexity that reside in the scientific world, and especially in environmental science, where there's just so many different factors and things that you need to look at to fully understand and comprehend like what's actually happening. And there's not a direct path to get to that conclusion.
Right. And just like where our focuses are. It's like you think a land walking giant man eating fish is scary. Wait till you hear about ecosystem collapse.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So is this a case of their bark being worse than their bite, or is it a case of they have a different type of bite than we were originally worried about? It'll be interesting to see, as more research and information comes out, what the quantifiable impacts of these invasive species is really going to be.
And I hope we don't have to find out. I hope we can.
Yeah, hopefully the new eradication methods and information that's out there right now spurs the containment of this non-native species.
Yeah.
So with that, I think we are done for this episode.
Yeah, I think that was great. Very interesting. I love fish. I think snakeheads are really cool in their own native habitat.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, I can't wait to see kind of, if we get on top of this and manage to get it under wraps before it starts to be a bigger problem.
If other stuff comes out and there's new information or control methods that are being implemented that are effective, we'll definitely do a snip on it, or just at least update you in a forthcoming episode.
Yeah, we can keep tabs.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you guys for listening. I hope you learned a thing or two, and we will see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Anthropocene.
Be sure to follow us on all social media and feel free to reach out to us with any comments, corrections, or suggestions for future episodes or species you'd like to see us cover. So northern snakehead, with its more temperate climate within the native, what the fuck with its
Right.